Hi, I'm Don Rittner.
And I'm Justina Kostek.
Today we're going to continue exploring Sharon Springs in upstate New York.
Sharon Springs may be a small village, but many people who live there are known around the world.
So come along with us as we find more
History on the road. How unlikely it would be to find an Irish Pulitzer Prize-winning poet and his New York Times best-selling wife in a small upstate village, so far from the hustle and bustle of a large urban city. But Paul Muldoon and Jean Banff Korelitz have made Sharon Springs their home. We decided to see what attracted them to Sharon Springs.
Hey, Paul.
How are you?
Hi, Jane.
Nice to see you, Justina. How are you?
Paul, hi, Jean.
We're great. Good to see you. All right.
Come on in.
Thank you. So Paul and Jean, you're two successful writers from New York City. And so the first question is, what are you doing in Sharon Springs?
Sharon Springs is the center of the universe. Where else would we be?
That's a good point.
Well, you know, we were on an adventure. We were going from actually Long Island to Buffalo, as it turns out.
Why were we going to Buffalo?
Well, we were going to Buffalo to see the Rolling Stones.
Why else were we going?
We were going to
Buffalo?
see the Mormon.
That's right.
The Mormon pageant.
Mormon pageant at Hill Cumorah, because one of us has a big Mormon history fixation. I
So
won't say which one.
exactly halfway between the two places is Sharon Springs. And of course we were familiar, or Jean was more familiar
I'd
with
read
Sharon Springs.
I'd read a book by Josh Kilmer Purcell about his adventure with Brent Ridge, coming up here and trying to be goat farmers, and I said, you know, I read about this interesting town. Why don't we spend the night there? We couldn't do the whole trip in one day. So we booked a room in the American Hotel, and the next morning we went for a walk. And usually I'm the one trying to get Paul to walk farther and faster. But on that particular day, I had a bad knee, and I kept saying, let's stop, let's stop. He kept saying, let's keep going, let's keep going.
Let's keep going.
And it literally had never happened before in all the years we've been together, that he was the one saying, you know, let's not turn around. And we came to this house, and it was just like something out of a movie. I mean, there was a for sale sign that looked pretty neglected. House looked a little neglected. We called the number, and
The realtor was round within
realtor
a couple
came
of
running
minutes.
over. But you know, we couldn't walk away from this house. We weren't looking for a house. We didn't particularly want a house, but this house would not brook no for an answer. So.
And then, of course, I think there was the sense that the village of Sharon Springs is a place that, as they say in Ireland, which is where I'm from, is coming down with history. There's so much actually that imbues the fabric of this place. You know, the sense of the native peoples, and this being very much on one of their main thoroughfares or highways. I'm very interested in Joseph Brant, the great Mohawk chieftain, and I'd written about him years ago. And this is very close to his neighborhood. And also, of course, more recently, we're very conscious of the history of this. Well, first of all, the hop growing industry, which of course went bust around about the time of Prohibition. Then, of course, the fact that it was such a major spa town and a Jewish spa town, and we happen to, you know, strong Jewish connections, and we were interested in that. Then the fact that it's a town that is coming back. You know, it was on its uppers, as they say, which is an odd phrase. One would expect it to mean, you know, sort of
downers.
on one's downers, but on the uppers of one's shoes, in a poor state for a while. And actually, you know, it's a very vital town now. So much has been done over the last 20 years to revitalize the place. So we like actually to be involved in that.
Yeah.
You know?
Well, Justina also mentioned that you get a special feeling
There's a certain creative energy around here. Do you feel that
There
too?
really is. And the Doug Plummer, who's our mayor, and sort of even if he weren't the mayor, he would be the mayor. He has this theory that Sharon Springs is a vortex that brings in the right people, and I have noticed that people who come in and they do something. It's like improv, yes and. Somebody starts a theater company, somebody starts a shop, somebody starts a bakery. Paul started the poetry festival. It's nice. You kind of want to be part of the updraft of what's happening here. But it's also fascinating because we have pride flags in the village, and then you leave the village, and the first thing you see is a Confederate flag, and that is very much something that we're aware of. Is we have this kind of special little place, and it does not seem to be filtering out to the surrounding area, but you can only live your life and try and do good things and be visible for people to become aware of poetry and whatnot.
Can you tell us about the poetry festival?
I myself write poems or try to write poems, so I'm always interested in encouraging people to read poetry. I mean, it's one of the terrible facts of life that even among very well-educated people who read novels, who read non-fiction, who read biographies by the score, actually, people in English departments, indeed, actually read very little poetry. They've been put off it for a range of reasons over the course of their lifetimes. So, in a strange way, it's something of a self-serving business. Not that I at all want them to read my poems, but I think we have to nurture a reading public. And one of the things about poetry is that we have to learn to read it. We have to learn actually to watch television. We don't realize that we have to learn to watch television. And we learn incompletely. In fact, I sometimes say to Jean, wait a minute, is this a dream sequence? Is this a flashback? Is this, which year is this? So actually, we have to be educated in watching a movie or a television show or a play, a piece of theatre, in the same way that we have to learn how to read a poem. We've had a lot of fun eating a lot of popcorn and learning how to watch a movie. We haven't had so much fun, often, learning to read a poem.
Maybe you should try adding popcorn. Maybe that's the answer.
It's, in a strange way, that's what one's doing, because I think generally when people meet poets, that's the popcorn. They realize actually that poets, rather than being a bunch of dead boys, and I mean boys, that actually they are just ordinary enough people who happen to have a particular line of business, You've got the plumber in town, you've got the physician. The poet has a role in society also that were they allowed to, really, were they given a little more space in society, I think would actually help society to understand itself, and maybe even be good for the health of society and for the functioning of society in just the way that the physician and the plumber contribute their skills.
The poets do think differently because you write differently. Where, you write a novel, it's pretty much, A to Z reading. Where poetry, depending on the poem, has different kinds of, beats to it. And you have to really learn how to read the beat, really. And I mean, I've published over 50 books. I've written one poem in my life.
Well, it's
And
early
it's like,
days.
I love poetry, but it's just, I can't seem to, get it.
Each of these genres has its own. One almost needs to be in the way of it. It's like a habit of mind. I mean, I would never in a million years even think of sitting down to write a novel. I just know I couldn't do it, you know. Whereas Jean, you know, it's something that actually you've sort of developed, in a way, the habit of thinking in a certain way, of being able to. It's as if you're trained really for a longer course. You know, poets tend to be sprinters.
Yeah.
They tend to be They tend to be.
He's so lucky though, because if he, you know, spends 3 or 4 days on a poem and it's a failure, it's 3 or 4 days. If I write a novel and it's a failure, it's years.
Yeah, right.
I've blown years.
So it's really more about a habit of mind, I think, and each has its own great attractions. In fact, in a strange way, most of the literature that means most to me, it is actually written in prose, you know, and you know, just from my own culture, James Joyce, for example, is, you know, one of those writers who seems to transcend such ideas of genre. Just comes into mind, of course, that Oscar Wilde is another of my countrymen who actually spent some time in Sharon Springs.
One day.
Right.
One day.
One day.
Well-
But, you know, but it's Oscar Wilde, so one day.
So now we're celebrating
important.
Oscar Wilde Day
Right.
every August
August 11th.
11th.
Amazing.
Yeah.
August 11, 1882, Oscar arrived here, and he came down to the Pavilion Hotel
Right over there.
just behind us here, and gave a talk. And
On the new aesthetic.
Well, I mean, you've seemed to, you've done quite well with poetry. Didn't you win the Pulitzer Prize?
I did win the Pulitzer Prize.
A little thing. That's...
Well, someone has to do it. Each year, someone has to do it. You know, of course, it's almost 20 years ago. But, you know, I was delighted to win it. And, you know, having said that, you know, there are many good poets out in the world who don't win prizes.
Well, I think of Charlie Plano, one of the Beat poets.
Yes.
Who's great, you know, really great, and for his time, you know, represented the Beat generation, later on the 60s, and so he hasn't won anything.
Well, you know, I mean, that is one of the things about all these art forms. I mean, we do tend to think in terms of prizes these days, or at least many people seem to think in those terms. You know, it won this, it won that. It's unfortunate because there are comparatively few prizes to be won. But there are many, many excellent writers out there, and they can't all win everything.
I have not won the Pulitzer Prize,
Yeah.
by way of
There's
example.
still time.
but the point is, but that's not why we do this.
No.
That's what I
we
was going
don't.
to say. You're not writing because you're looking for the
Yes.
prize, right?
The prize is in doing it.
Yeah, it's the passion,
Yes.
right?
Yeah.
Jean, one of your books is being turned into a miniseries. Could you tell us
it's
about
really
it?
exciting. It's starting this October 25th. The book is called You Should Have Known, but they've changed the title to The Undoing. We were able to see 5 of the 6 episodes, and they're great. They're not entirely identical to the book, but I've also had a book made into a film, so I'm used to that experience of watching the story go off in a different direction. But it's very exciting, and it's terrific. I think people will really like it.
And that's with Nicole Kidman, right?
Nicole Kidman, Hugh Grant,
Fascinating.
Donald Sutherland. A lot of really good people are in it. Yeah.
No, my problem is that so far none of my poems has been made into a film, or as I call them, a miniseries.
So miniseries.
I cannot look at the word miniseries. I have to think, what is that word? Miniseries.
When did you start writing poetry? When did you know you were a poet?
Well, that's an interesting question because there's several answers to it. I started writing poetry when I was a teenager. As you know, many people who are in the arts world in the broadest sense begin quite early on. And so I was a schoolboy when I started, and I read T.S. Eliot. T.S. Eliot is a great writer for any age, but he's a particularly good writer for the teenager. because so many of his poems, one of his most famous poems, as you know, The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock, is about a character who's wondering, what am I going to do? Should I do it? Can I do it? It's the perfect subject matter for a teenager, it's teenage angst. Though Prufrock himself is not necessarily a teenager, but he embodies teenage spirit. So I started with T.S. Eliot, and at some level, and this of course is true of most writers, I thought, I actually might be able to do that, which of course is crazy. But I spent years in a room. I was encouraged by my teachers, which is one of the reasons, by the way, why I, for example, go into the school here in Sharon Springs and work with the young people on their poems, because again, I think it's absolutely vital that young people see that writers are essentially ordinary people. And the sense that they can do it as teenagers is very important, because they can. They can do it. They really can. So that's how I started. And then, like so many things, it's a habit. But many people write when they're teenagers. Most people get out of the habit. For me...
Why do you think?
Why do
people, because you're right, I remember as a kid, a lot of my friends wrote poetry, and then, now they're truck drivers and, whatever, and they haven't picked up a pen in years.
Well,
why is it that you're doing it, and all of a sudden it's like, well, I don't want to do that anymore?
Well, I think there are various answers. I'm not sure if I have a single answer, or indeed if a range of these answers is really, really gives a sense of why. First of all, people get self-conscious. When you're the best poets actually are generally 9 or 10 years of age. And the reason why they're the best in my book is that they have absolutely no idea what they're doing. And that for me is the key to being, in my case anyway, a poet. I never know what I'm doing. I work on the principle, and I say to my students, if I know what I'm doing, you probably know what I'm doing. And it's of comparatively little interest. So I want to be in a place... Now, I think if you're writing novels, it's a bit different. You sort of have to, because as you say, if I spend a couple of days writing a poem and it doesn't work out, it actually doesn't matter. But probably to have some sort of a plan, you need some kind of a plan if you're writing a novel.
You need it to work out.
Well, but mind you, it never quite works out, I think, to plan. Is that correct also?
Well, we have a certain advantage. I say we, writers of fiction, have a certain advantage, which is that we take a little time to get better. And when young people come to me with their fiction and they ask, am I good enough? I always tell them that's the wrong question, because at your age, you don't have to be good enough. You just have to keep going, and you have to read. You'd be amazed how many people want to be writers, but they don't read. I personally can't think of a single truly great novel written by somebody under, I'm going to say 28. And this is a good thing, because it means that we get a little space and time to get better, to improve. My first 2 novels were rejected everywhere on the planet, and now I'm glad that I had a little time to get better. Nobody's ever going to see those novels. It's probably a good thing. Although, as I say, at the time it was was pretty unhappy about it. But, we're not like gymnasts or ballet dancers. If you haven't made it by 20, it's over. Right. We really have this luxury of time, but we also have a responsibility to do the work and to read.
It's a strange business, because I there are no hard and fast rules about this, but I suspect that just as prose fiction writers tend to improve the more they do it, unfortunately for me, poets disimprove.
Really?
Yeah, the more they do it. You know, when you get past 28 in the poetry business, it's downhill.
Well, by that token, we would have split up by now, right?
Why is that? A range of reasons. People start to believe their own publicity. People actually begin to think they're really good at it. And that's, I think, in most departments, that's a mistake, you know?
Well, then you tend to think you can do anything.
Well,
and
you know,
everybody-
and the thing is, of course, that at some level you have to believe you can. I mean, it takes a certain nerve. It takes a certain nerve to imagine for a minute that one could write a poem.
I think it's the most difficult thing ever.
On the other hand, it also requires a sense that, it demands an extraordinary amount of humility and a realization that, in fact, the chances of your doing it or doing it well are very slim.
So arrogance and humility.
I think that's right. I mean,
Together.
I think that's right.
Combo.
Well, you know, I think it takes nerve and nervousness.
Yeah. In Saratoga, Cafe Lena, they always had poetry night. Of course, everybody's closed now because of the pandemic. But I used to go to it a lot, and I'd sit there and I'd listen, and then some of them you go, wow, that's really good, and then some of them you go, oh, why are you standing up there? You know, because it just sounded so bad, and I don't think I could take the rejection.
Well, here's the thing. If you're going to be a plumber, you actually need to know something about how to bend a pipe, right? Or if indeed does one bend a pipe anymore. You have to know something maybe about soldering, or does one? One has to know something about plastic. One has to be able to use a tape measure, right? If you're a physician, you probably need a training, right? You probably can't hang out your shingle and say, come on in, boys and girls and whatever, I'm your man. You know, let me operate on you. Whereas, actually, anybody can set up as a poet. And nobody much is going to say, you know what, you're not a poet.
Jean, what inspired you to start writing?
I think I always loved language, and I loved stories, and I had a lot of, fear about whether I had it in me to write fiction. I actually wrote poetry for many years. When Paul and I met, I was only writing poetry.
But she's okay now.
I'm okay now. But I mean, Paul talked about T.S. Eliot. I had writers like that too, who just woke me up and thrilled me. And you want to do that. The thing that you love, you want to do. And I think, there's a lot of fear. There's a lot of, in my case, I had the humility already. I had to find the arrogance to try. And there's a lot of picking yourself up and saying, okay, that didn't work. I'm going to do it again. I think a lot of writers, if they produce a book and if it does not succeed, they're full of resentment and anger and sadness, and that's all understandable. But then you have to do it again. You have to do it again. You just have to keep doing it again. And I think I completely understand why somebody would not be able to do that. And I'm actually not sure how I got my act together to do it, but I did.
Well, it's also solitary. Writing's a solitary.
It is, although, with the advent of the coffee shop, there are so many people in the coffee shops, right? And you have a kind of camaraderie. And I just mentioned there's a man we know, Michael Marin, who is a filmmaker married to a novelist and memoirist called Danny Shapiro. He made a film a few years ago called A Short History of Decay. And in this film, he planned a little sight gag. His film was about a failed writer, a failed novelist. And some of it takes place in Brooklyn. And he goes to his local coffee shop, in Brooklyn, and he's waiting online. And as he's waiting online, he's looking at all the people sitting there in the coffee shop, and he imagines that they're all writing, the great American novel. And Michael Maron's idea was to fill the coffee shop with actual writers, like well-known writers. And, I was invited to come, and I was by no means as well-known as some of the other writers who were there, but it was hilarious. So if you see the film, this poor guy, he's a failed writer, he's online to get his coffee, and he looks up and there's Kurt Anderson and there's Jennifer Egan. It was a very funny scene. So these days, you don't have to be alone in a garret. You can go to a shared workspace or something like that. But it's really whatever gets the words on the page. For example, I had a desk in my office for years until I finally admitted to myself that I don't write at a desk. I got rid of the desk. I've never missed it.
Well, how did the two of you meet in the first place? I'm sure there's a story there.
There are a few stories. Actually, Paul doesn't remember our first meeting, so that's always fun. I went to hear him give a reading. I was studying in England at the time, and I was writing poetry, and I knew Paul's poetry, and he was giving a reading in London, so I got on the train, went down, heard him read. He signed my book, the whole thing. Has no memory of it at all. So we met again about
I'm not sure about that.
No memory at all. We got together about 6 months later when we met again. That was 1985. So yeah, we're quite long in the tooth
It was
now.
pretty much love at first sight in my case. I don't know about yours, but in my case it was.
And that was in England.
That happened to be in England, yeah.
How'd you guys get here? You weren't born in England, though, right?
No, I'm a New Yorker.
Yeah.
We stayed for a few more years living in Ireland and then living in England. And then Paul was hired pretty much simultaneously at Princeton and Columbia. And that was when we decided to come back to New York. And
How'd you get the gig at New Yorker?
I'm not sure.
Just call you up and go, we need a
Pretty much.
3,000 homes we get every week.
They did, yeah.
Oh, really? They
I
did.
believe they did. I think, actually, to be serious, not that I wasn't being serious there, I had actually edited one of those best of the poetry year anthologies. What are those called?
like the best American poetry.
Yeah, I had actually edited one of those best American poetry anthologies sometime shortly before I started the New Yorker, and I have a feeling that may have lain behind it to some extent, because it was this particular anthology that I edited, I think gave a sense of quite a broad range of taste, which I have. I'm interested in a very wide range of poetries. You know, I have no kind of strict rules about what a poem should look like, what it shouldn't look like. I'm not into any of that at all. A poem for me can come into the world in a very wide range of modes. And I think that was probably evident from that anthology, and that may have been one of the reasons why I was asked to do it. And that's something I certainly tried to do in the 10 years that I was there. You know, I think you have to reflect really good writing, but I think actually one has to reflect, coincidentally, something of the range of what our culture looks like, what the range of ethnicities and interests that we have as a whole culture. So I think that was something certainly that I tried to do. It's an interesting job, but a thankless job at the end of the day, because for every person to whom one says yes, there are actually hundreds or thousands to whom one says no. And, no one wants to be the person who says no. So 10 years of that was plenty for me. And also I think it's important that those jobs have a turnover, that a new intellect and, kind of a new system of taste comes to those jobs. 10 years a long time.
Paul, was any of your poetry turned into songs?
Along with trying to write poems, and I never put it any stronger than that, I actually also try to write songs. The two activities are akin. They're using words, they're using often more than in the poem. Actually, the song is almost always using rhyme, whereas most poets nowadays, the vast majority of them, don't use rhyme. So I actually try to write songs as well as poems, and a number of the poems have been set to music, and I've written for musical setting. I've written an opera, I've tried to write a musical, just recently actually, and so I'm interested in words and music. So I write songs. I have a band to which I belong.
They've performed up here, Sharon Springs.
It's a rock and roll band.
Really?
Yes.
It really is a rock and roll.
It really is a rock and roll band.
This is the logo, actually.
Really? An elephant?
Well, it's an elephant, but
You
it's
need
a
a good
terrible
drummer?
logo, actually. I mean, I've always felt that.
I'm going to take that as a trick question.
I was a rock and roll drummer for 20 years.
Fun enough, I was talking to somebody yesterday, and they said to me, how do you know the drum? I'm sure you're familiar with all these. How do you know the drummer's knocking at your door?
Don't know this one.
The knocking speeds up as it goes along. Anyway,
I thought
so
you were
anyway,
going to make a Spinal Tap reference
So
there.
true.
no. So yeah, I'm fascinated by rock and roll. I was brought up, as on rock and roll,
Beatles.
on the Beatles.
What's the name of the band?
The band is called Rogue Oliphant. Oliphant,
Oliphant.
Oliphan't, which is an elephant. It's a surname. Its name actually, there was a very famous novelist called Mrs. Oliphant. The theory is that a person named Oliphant was actually involved in ivory trading. They think that's where it may come from. I'm not absolutely certain about that. It's generally a Scottish name. But anyway, Rogue Oliphant. So it's a rock band. It's available there on all the major channels. Is it?
iTunes and
All,
Spotify.
all,
It's on
of,
Spotify. Yeah.
all of that stuff, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, it turned out to be a kind of a joke question. Turned out to be reality.
I think with him, there are fewer things that he hasn't tried to write than that he has.
Well,
So you only live once. You have to try everything.
well, let me give you a line from one of my songs.
Okay.
You're only young once. It's true. But you're only old once too. Which has a deathless feel to it, I think. As a,
Like a Black Sabbath.
absolutely. I'm just waiting for the band that's going to pick that up and make it number one.
So how many poems have you written? Do you have a count?
I don't. I do not. I couldn't tell you. I've written. Yeah, it doesn't matter. The big question is, I've written 14 books of poems, right? But the big question is, are any of them any good? And it's
People are reading them, right?
2 or 3 people are reading them. 2 or 3 people are reading them.
That's better than none.
Well, funny enough, again, I was laughing with somebody yesterday. You know what they call the time coming up to the publication of a book of poems? The calm before the calm. I mean, with a miniseries or a miniseries or whatever it is, there's a bit of buzz about. There's a bit of buzz about it, you know.
We have a bit of that in fiction too.
Yeah,
The
you
calm
do. And
before
with
the calm.
fiction, there's buzz. But honestly, the poetry business, as a friend of mine in Belfast, and a distinguished older poet in Belfast, he was then an older poet, he said, you know, if you go into the poetry business, it's nobody's fault but your own. And it's absolutely true. You cannot expect anything. You know, if you go into the novel business, maybe your novel will be made into a film.
Well, I mean, it's interesting that has become the yardstick by which even we in this world are. I mean, I'm going through this now with my new novel I'm talking to producers next week, and it's exciting, but it's a novel. It's still a novel, you know. My responsibility ends after the end.
I don't take it as a yardstick, of course. That's not really what I mean. But I mean, it's an indicator that there's a wider interest. I mean, first of all, more people read them,
and yet, when I go give a reading somewhere, I'm lucky if 10 people come, and he can give a reading in some hole in the hedge, in some state that you can't even spell, and there will be hundreds of people there. So it's a bit of a paradox, but I just think that says something about the enduring, nature of poetry.
Well, I think a poet, there's a certain, not reputation, but sort of cred about being a poet. I mean, there are a lot of writers, but a poet kind of stands out, by him or herself, When you say poet, it's not like, well, that's writes novels or writes books or writes whatever, but they do stand out by themselves.
It's funny, I mean, even though I'm almost 70 and even though I've written a lot of poems, or tried to, very, very rarely, if ever, would I introduce myself as a poet, Because most of the time, let's face it, when somebody comes up to you and says, I am a poet, you want to run.
It's like saying I'm a shaman.
Well, no, I'd be more interested in a shaman, actually.
I'm a will-o'-the-wisp.
But in any case, having said that, I actually must, one of these days, stop doing that and just say, yeah, that's actually what I do. This is what I do. I get up at 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning and I start writing poems. That's what I do, You're the plumber, you're a physician, you're a psychiatrist, you're a punk rocker, and this is actually what I am.
Yeah. What's your biggest satisfaction? Is it completing a poem? Is it somebody else liking it? Or, it's like we all have to have some kind of gratification for what we do.
The gratification's an interesting term. I myself, I don't think I'm the only one who believes this. It's a kind of chemical dependency, actually. There's a certain buzz that comes from having, when a metaphor, a simile is interesting, right? Something is interesting. I mean, I just wrote a poem the other day in which a chipmunk, and there are many chipmunks around here, I describe the chipmunk as being like a flame-streaked roadster, fresh from the paint booth or the spray booth, right? Just the streak along the side of a chipmunk. And, when that image came to me, I thought, wow. I mean, I actually had a physical response to it because there's something about it. You think, wow, that's never been, I don't think anybody has seen that before. A, and B, in some sense, no one after this little 3-line poem will ever look again at a chipmunk in the same light.
I mean, after reading that poem.
What did I say?
You don't mean that because the poem is in the world, it will change for everybody?
No. No, but what I mean is, that sounds, I don't mean, it's a tiny little image, but
somebody else is going to see that image now.
it's,
That you put out there.
well, here's the thing. When in the world, apparently, when connections are made in the world, connections of all sorts, actually, our brain, the pleasure centers of the brain are provoked, and there is a feel-good aspect to it.
That seems to be true in art generally. don't you
Totally.
think? Like if you look at a painting, or read a poem, read a book, there's a certain pleasure reaction you get from it, or a satisfaction.
It's about making connections, and it's not only in the arts. I think it's in many spheres. Probably in mathematics, physics. I'd imagine when things come together, and so when you've tested that, as it were, when you've had that experience. I mean, I assume it's a bit like, taking cocaine or heroin or something. I think there is a chemical element to it, and at some level you want to come back for more.
Yeah, it was something Sylvia Plath described in one of her essays. Very famous moment in which she describes her mother reading Matthew Arnold to her when she was a child, and having a spark fly off the language and landing on her, and realizing that she had discovered a new way to be happy. And I think for many of us, we've all had a moment like that. We're really lucky.
So you feel the same way. I mean,
Absolutely.
You get the same kind of reaction.
Absolutely. Yeah. Language is an amazing thing.
That was a great conversation with two very successful authors living in Sharon Springs, New York.
Yeah, it almost makes me want to write my own book now.
And she did.
So we will see you again on History on the Road.
So let's visit one as we continue exploring history on the road.
On the road.
Where were you?
More. You missed one word.
missed a
You
word?
missed the word more.
I did?